order of business is to hear from Brad Maycomer, who's Fletcher's media support super specialist. And he's going to explain how the Q&A portion of today's program is going to be organized. Brad, take it over.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us. So we're trying to recreate the feel of actually being in the reading room and interacting in a more personal way. So if you'd like to ask a question, I'd ask you to raise your little blue hand. If you open up your participants panel, you can see a little option to raise hand, and I'll get a list going. And when you're ready to ask your question, we're going to make you a panelist so that you can actually be on screen to ask Professor Drezner your question. If you prefer not to be on screen, that's absolutely fine. You can use the Q&A function and type in your question, and somebody will read it, and we'll get your question answered that way. But we'd love to have you join us on screen so everybody can see. And when you do, please, introduce yourself and tell us your affiliation with Fletcher.
Great. Thanks, Brad. So hello again to everyone. Welcome to the first Ginn Library Book Talk of the year. This is the forum where we all get a chance to speak with our faculty about their research, their writing, and the books that they produce. I know we have at least two more talks coming this year. Professors Schultz and Burgess both have new books. But today, we're delighted to be hosting the ever-entertaining and insightful Professor Dan Drezner, who will be discussing his new book, Toddler in Chief: What Donald Trump Teaches Us About the Modern Presidency. And with only 45 days, 12 hours, and 25 minutes approximately left until Election Day, this is the perfect season for a look at presidential politics. Introducing Professor Drezner is Sulmaan Khan, Professor of International History and Chinese Foreign Relations here at Fletcher. He's having a little technical issue today. It occurs to me, Professor Khan, that while Professor Drezner is probably the professor most likely here at Fletcher for you to encounter on Twitter, Professor Khan is probably at the other end of that spectrum and the least likely person to come across in the Twitter world. So take it over, Professor Khan.
All right, says the non-Twitterer. First of all, thank you all for bearing with me while I tried to figure out modern technology. And I apologize for any difficulties that my Zoom incompetence today caused. The second thing I want to say is how grateful I am that Brad and Ellen have tried to recreate this in some way, shape, or form. Because, Professor Drezner and I were joking around the other day about what exactly constitutes rock star faculty. And I would say that faculty who don't do research are not exactly rock stars, to put it mildly. I've got a harsher diatribe on that I'll spare you. But it is important, incredibly important, that people keep reading, keep thinking, keep writing in academia. And what Ellen and her merry gang at the library have done through the series of book talks is to have connected everybody with that vital work of the university. And for that, Ellen, we really can't be grateful enough. It occurs to me that the first book talk I attended at Fletcher actually was Professor Drezner's. The System Worked had just come out. It was a memorable book talk for many reasons, not least because Professor Klein broke into an inimitable rendition of Buddy, Can You Spare a Dime? That's not going to happen today. But Dan, in many ways, to my mind, exemplifies the kind of real-life engaged professor that Michael Crichton talked about in Jurassic Park, but who also really represents what a policy school is supposed to do. The Michael Crichton bit comes in because the mathematicians, for the person who just snickered there, I'm pretty sure that was Dan, comes in because the mathematicians, according to Crichton, had started using computers, read Twitter for nowadays, and behave like rock stars. Dan is probably the humblest rock star I know, but even before Kim Kardashian was protesting by boycotting social media, Dan had actually gone and broken Twitter, which brings us to the book today. Dan Drezner broke Twitter rather than boycott it. with a thread about the presidency. I still don't quite understand what a thread is, but it in some ways makes me the perfect audience for this book talk. So Dan broke Twitter, and of course, because it was a tweet, as I recall, about Trump growing into the presidency when his staff had talking about him like a toddler. This was a never-ending story, really. Or if you would, it was the Arabian Nights, where you'll recall that Shahrazad tried to get a reprieve from execution by spinning a new yarn each night, except nowadays it feels like we're being executed each day. And the reprieve, when it comes, is going to be normalcy, if that ever occurs. So, and by curating a bunch of tweets, Dan, lo and behold, managed to produce a meditation on the modern presidency. It went beyond the Twitter thread to really ask what this institution that defines modern America in ways both good and bad, and therefore has an enormous impact on the rest of the world, also for good and bad, is. I think a sequel or series of sequels is probably in the works already because the story hasn't ended. But to tell you about Trump, toddlers, and Twitter, please welcome my very good friend, Dan Drezner.
Thank you very much, Professor Khan. That was a lovely introduction. And thank you all thank you for everyone who is now listening in. I am going to share my screen so you can follow the PowerPoint along with me. And we will, hold on. There we go. And okay, can you all see this? I'm assuming you can, unless I hear otherwise. Okay, so let's get started. Basically, the book, The Toddler in Chief, makes two arguments, one which is relatively simple and one which is somewhat more complex. The simple argument is that Donald Trump behaves like a toddler, and that there is overwhelming evidence that Trump's behavior as president is consistent with that roughly of a petulant 2-year-old. The second and slightly more complex problem is that this is a bigger issue than it would have been, let's say, 50 years ago. That in essence, one of the problems with the presidency is that over the last 5 decades or so, whatever we would thought of as both the formal and informal guardrails that check the presidency have eroded badly. And so as a result, a lot of these guardrails were worn down long before Trump came to office, but we didn't notice them because previous presidents sort of still were able to act within those guardrails. Trump, because he acts and behaves like a toddler, is exposing just the degree to which the guardrails on the American presidency have worn down so badly. So let's start with the Trump being a toddler thing. What am I arguing? I am not arguing that Trump biologically is a toddler. We've had many doctors, some of whom are admittedly of dubious provenance, who nonetheless concur that Trump is biologically, a borderline obese white male in his 70s. Also, to be absolutely clear, this is not a Benjamin Button situation. He's not aging into being a toddler. He's definitely getting older. I'm not claiming that Trump biologically is a toddler. What I'm claiming is that he acts like one. And that if you take a look at all of the behavioral traits, they are consistent with those of a badly behaved small child. And so he sure shooting acts like it. Now, this is a strong claim. As a social scientist, I can argue this is a relatively, serious claim to make, and somewhat counterintuitive. First of all, Trump is actually the oldest person ever to be elected president. So the idea that you would associate him with toddlerdom is a little bit odd. Furthermore, if you take a look at the panoply of Trump's, both his personal scandals and his political scandals, these are not forms of behavior that we associate with small children, particularly small innocent children. And so to compare the two does seem somewhat odd. And I want to be very clear when I say that Trump is acting like a toddler. This is not meant to insult toddlers. Toddlers are adorable. I mean, look at that picture on the right. They're just freaking adorable, okay? Toddlers are much cuter. And in some ways, what I am trying to say is that when toddlers act this way, they are doing so because of the cognitive limitations that they experience simply because they are 2 years old. They often navigate the world with much, fewer reserves than most adults have. And so as a result, they wind up acting out in certain ways. Trump has no excuse. He is, a biological, white man in his 70s. He should be able to behave in a more mature fashion. But the interesting thing is that he doesn't. And it's worth noting that, a lot of commentators, part of the inspiration for writing this book was that if you recall back in the early days of 2017, when Donald Trump just came to the presidency, there was this truly aching desire, I think, among certain members of the mainstream media to normalize Donald Trump. And by that, I mean that there was a lot of concern, obviously, during the 2016 campaign about whether or not Donald Trump really could be president. And Trump himself, his campaign, and an awful lot of pundits sort of argued, in essence, that the presidency would discipline him, that he would grow into the presidency, that even if he campaigned in an immature fashion, Trump himself once claimed that he would be so presidential that everyone would be bored. And similarly, as he, during this transition period in his first couple of months as president, you saw almost an instinctive desire by a lot of mainstream media commentators to make Trump seem like he was acting like a normal president. So, for example, during Trump's first joint address to Congress, Van Jones, claimed this is the day that Donald Trump became president because he gave a somewhat successful speech. Similarly, when Trump had to provide an explanation for why he decided to bomb Syria, Fareed Zakaria argued that that was the day he became president, which was a slightly odd claim to make. And indeed, if you take a look at the sort of observations made by others, those of Zakaria and Jones would be safely described as outliers. Most people do not think that Donald Trump has really grown into the presidency. The number of editorial cartoons I could have put in this slide are truly massive. Numbers of people, associate Trump with toddlerdom. It's not just him, of course. It is also Democrats who certainly make this comparison. Joe Biden, when he was running in the primary, described Trump as the whiner-in-chief rather than the commander-in-chief. Both Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi have basically described negotiations with Trump in which he, according to them, have temper tantrums or has a meltdown. And Pelosi in particular has been rather severe, describing Trump as having too short of an attention span to be president and simply not knowing enough to be president. But of course, these are Democrats. We would expect them, to make this sort of observation, and we would expect, editorial cartoonists to lampoon him as well. And God knows we would expect, the mainstream media, as we understand it, ranging from people on the left to sort of, respectable House Republicans in the New York Times to describe Trump in similar fashion. Certainly, if you were a Trump supporter, if you were a hardcore MAGA booster, none of this is going to be persuasive. This is just evidence of the swamp ganging up against Donald Trump, which is why what struck me when I was, starting this book or even coming up with the idea for this book is that the bulk of the evidence that's in it about people who describe Donald Trump as a toddler comes not from Democrats, comes not from mainstream media pundits, doesn't come from Never Trump Republicans. It comes from Trump's own supporters. And indeed, if you see the tweet on the right, that is the very first tweet in what has now become the toddler-in-chief thread. And to explain it to Sulmaan and others who are not necessarily Twitter savvy, basically a Twitter thread is that if you write one tweet and then respond to that tweet, and then you respond to the response and so on and so forth, you have a linked chain of tweets where you can scroll down and see, the argument that's being put forward. And essentially, I wrote this tweet back in April of 2017 when I read a Washington Post story that really did describe him as one would describe a 2-year-old. And it was coming on the heels of Zakaria and Jones making these sort of arguments that Trump had really grown into the presidency. And, I sort of did this and didn't think that much of it. And then about a day later, I saw another story that, again, described him in the same way you would describe a 2-year-old. And the thread was born. So I basically, it's worth noting that, essentially, pretty much, to get onto this thread for, criteria for inclusion, first, there had to be a story in the mainstream media in which, someone described Trump the way you would describe a 2-year-old. And, I certainly drew from the American Academy of Pediatrics Guide to Raising Small Children as sort of a guide for toddler behavior, as well as my own experience having to raise 2 toddlers with my wife. Second, the sourcing had to be reputable. I mean, it had to be, a mainstream media outlet that I trusted. And third, and this was the most important, the person making the comment, the person describing Trump, even if they were anonymous, had to be someone that you would presume had a rooting interest in Donald Trump's success. So it had to be a White House staffer, or a cabinet officer, or a sub-cabinet officer, or a GOP member of Congress, or a Hill staffer, or a country that was a treaty ally of the United States. All of these actors had a strong disincentive to describe Trump in ways that would infantilize him. The fact that they did so suggested that there was probably something, afoot. And there are lots of anonymous quotes. It's not hard to find. This is sort of the bread and butter of the way that the mainstream media reports. You can see some of them, on this screen. And Trump, supporters could argue, well, wait a minute, as Trump himself has claimed, that these anonymous sources are made up, that you really should only trust sources on the record. Now, there's a variety of reasons why you can not believe that. Indeed, it's standard practice in the White House when they provide briefings to reporters for them to be done so on background. But more importantly, there are plenty of on-the-record quotes as well of sort of die-hard Trump supporters, nonetheless describing him the way you would describe a petulant toddler. These are the ones on the screen. I couldn't fit all of the ones that are good on the screen. My favorite is, or one of my favorites is Tucker Carlson, who said, "I've come to believe that Trump's role is not as a conventional president who promises to get certain things achieved to the Congress and then does. I don't think he's capable. I don't think he's capable of sustained focus. I don't think he understands the system." This is from one of Donald Trump's most diehard supporters on Fox News. If he's describing Trump in these terms, you can only imagine what others are. And so if we take a look, and this is actually new data, as I started adding to the Toddler thread, basically it was sort of an unconscious form of data collection. And this demonstrates the growth of the thread over time. And as you can see, it's not that Donald Trump has grown into the office. He's actually gotten worse. He's demonstrated more and more toddler behavior over time. And indeed, the pandemic has been his sort of toddler behavior at his absolute worst. And what's also worth noting, by the way, that what's striking about this is the degree to which you would have expected these sorts of stories to actually go down rather than up, because essentially Trump has been so obsessed with loyalty that he keeps burning through staff to try to get staff that will presumably only be, loyal to him, as opposed to, minor things like democracy and the rule of law. Nonetheless, his toddler behavior is on the rise. So when I say toddler traits, what am I talking about? There are a variety of them described in the book, but the 6 that I'm quickly going to summarize here are temper tantrums, short attention span, poor impulse control, oppositional behavior, knowledge deficits, and too much screen time. So we'll start with temper tantrums, because in some ways this is the dominant mode in terms of Trump's behavior. And indeed, you'd be hard pressed to find a story, at least one story a week in which Trump does not have a meltdown or a temper tantrum of some kind. Now, this book was written, and completed in late 2019. There has been plenty of evidence since then that Trump has acted like a toddler. Indeed, at the start of the pandemic, as Trump was flying back from India, he did pitch a fit when CDC official Nancy Messonnier basically went and testified and said that community spread was already happening in the United States. And indeed, it took all of the CDC's efforts to prevent her from being fired. It was also extremely costly in terms of the U.S. response to the coronavirus, because Trump was so put out by that comment that the coronavirus task force couldn't bring up the idea of basically advocating lockdowns and quarantines for another week, which was an extremely costly week. Furthermore, Trump has demonstrated, anger also at the response to the riots or the protests that have occurred in response to the killing of George Floyd. Indeed, during the protests that took place in Lafayette Square, a story came out that Secret Service officials had escorted Trump to the bunker in the White House. Trump was livid about that story, and there is probably a decent causal link between his anger at that story and his decision to forcibly remove peaceful protesters from Lafayette Square a few days later. And this is a real problem because, presidents that have temper tantrums, it is almost impossible for the staff to properly staff them. If they're concerned about the president losing their temper, they are going to censor information that they get to him. And indeed, there are plenty of stories of, for example, U.S. intelligence officials being reluctant to talk about Russian interference in US electoral politics because Trump blows a gasket whenever this comes up. The second issue is short attention span. Anyone who has been around a small toddler for, or frankly, even a well-trained dog knows that they can get distracted extremely easily. And again, we see this, in terms of Trump's behavior, not just during the time that I was writing the book, but even after that. Indeed, in efforts to get Trump to pay attention to the coronavirus pandemic, his Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, tried to brief him on this in the third week of January. Trump, in response, immediately changed the conversation to questions about vaping because he couldn't, necessarily sit still. And indeed, the revival of Trump's sort of rallies, or now quasi-rallies, the disastrous one he had in Tulsa, the one that he had indoors in Nevada recently, his attempts to revive them, are basically an effort by Trump's staff to emotionally regulate Trump. Because during the sort of lockdown phase, he was apparently extremely fidgety. He felt like he was trapped in the White House, much like a 2-year-old who feels like they're grounded. Similarly, poor impulse control. There's no denying that this is the case. The thing that primarily distinguishes adults from toddlers is not necessarily the impulses we have, but rather that when you're an adult, you have the instinct to say, well, maybe this isn't the best idea. Trump, on the other hand, gives into his impulses. He just thinks of them as his gut instinct. And so this has led to fiascos, including during the pandemic. You can argue that Trump's tweets with respect to the travel ban on Europe, for example, caused such a widespread panic in Europe that it potentially made the pandemic worse, because he originally announced that there was going to be a travel ban on Europe that would be implemented immediately or within a day or two. It turned out that was not what he meant, but it didn't stop, thousands of Americans from thronging to airports, rushing to get back, and that in turn probably facilitated community spread in those airports, and so it was an issue. And again, one of the problems with poor impulse control is that in some ways it's a doom loop, because if Trump wants to do something but his staff feels like, well, he doesn't really mean this, he'll calm down, and then Trump finds out that it's not done, he will then obviously pitch a fit, and then it winds up getting done inevitably. This, combined with Twitter, is particularly disastrous, because essentially what has very frequently happened over the last 3 years is that Trump has tweeted something, and then the staff has essentially reverse engineer a process by which they can implement a policy that Trump wants to do, whether or not it's actually legal. Oppositional behavior. Now, we are all familiar with the 3-year-old that if you tell them to do something, they then do the exact opposite. And this is certainly true when it comes to Donald Trump. If Donald Trump is told he can't do something, or that if he's done something that's wrong, he will double, triple, quadruple down. We've seen this, for example, with respect to, I think the most amusing example, which was about a year ago, was Sharpiegate, when Trump tweeted erroneously, and I think genuinely innocently, that a hurricane that was about to strike the Gulf states might actually strike Alabama. The National Weather Service, at that point said it's not going to strike Alabama. That's all of our projections. And Trump continued to insist that he was right when he tweeted that, to the point of even drawing with a Sharpie on a hurricane map to demonstrate that Alabama really was under threat, which obviously wasn't true. I think we've also seen this in examples during the pandemic, particularly his emphasis on hydroxychloroquine as a potential cure, despite the fact that there was no evidence whatsoever to support that assertion. And indeed, we're now seeing it in terms of Trump's repeated insistences that a vaccine will be available or will be announced prior to Election Day, despite the fact that, the director of the CDC, Anthony Fauci, and others have basically said that is a pipe dream at best. It probably won't be ready until December. And then, there are knowledge deficits. And this is in some ways one of the most important things that distinguishes Trump from other examples of behavior, like, let's say, a moody teenager or, an older person, a sort of cranky old man. Even though, teenagers and cranky old men tend to have at least some knowledge about the way the world works. And what becomes increasingly clear is that Trump does not. Trump is the first president elected who has 0 military experience and 0 prior governmental experience. And this has come through, I think, perhaps most notoriously in his sort of free-ranging coronavirus press conferences back in the spring, to the point where he was suggesting that maybe something like bleach could be injected, somewhere as a way of purging the virus. sort of demonstrated the degree to which Trump really didn't know what he was talking about, but nonetheless wants to make it seem like he knows what he's talking about. And God knows, as a professor, I identify with that impulse. And then finally, there is too much screen time. Trump is an inveterate TV watcher. He watches Fox News and other news, a fair amount of the day. I think you could potentially argue 8 hours a day. When Trump has briefings in the Oval Office or meetings in the Oval Office, there are televisions on in the background. This can lead to certain forms of confusion. My personal favorite example of this is when Lindsey Graham was in the White House talking to Trump about North Korea. At the exact moment they were discussing something, suddenly Fox News, showed this broadcast of a missile being launched from North Korea. And Lindsey Graham, of all people, had to calm Trump down and tell him, that's B-roll you're watching. That's B-roll. That's not live footage. We're not going to war with North Korea. And so, it demonstrates the degree to which, Trump really does respond almost entirely based on what he sees on television, and to some extent has a limited ability to confuse what is on the TV with what is actually happening. So all of this leads to a dynamic in which Trump is, difficult to staff, and furthermore, therefore, extremely poorly staffed. Because in some ways, what you want to analogize the White House staff to is as kind of poorly, paid daycare workers, and child care workers. Now, you might think that this is an objectionable comparison because White House staffers tend to be better paid. But the truth is that if you have to service the president, the contrast is that if you're a child care, service provider, generally speaking, toddlers will recognize your authority. Trump, on the other hand, is the president of the United States. And so as a result, his staff's ability to actually control him or constrain him is severely limited. And this comes through, in a variety of ways. My personal favorite, I think, is Anthony Fauci. In an interview with Stat News, was being asked constantly about why in the spring Trump was having these press conferences in which no one was wearing masks and so on and so forth. And Fauci finally just sort of said in exasperation, I know, but what do you want me to do? I mean, seriously, let's get real. What do you want me to do? Anyone who has been the parent of a 2-year-old and their house is a mess should absolutely identify with that kind of story. And so as a result, Donald Trump has gone through this sort of highest, burn rate in staff history. And this is, a potential problem for him in terms of, being able to try to credibly have a competent staff. So the combined effects of all this on the Trump administration are not great. There is no viable policy planning process because Trump himself rejects the idea of policy planning. He wants to govern by his impulse. There are extremely high audience costs because Trump will repeatedly promise something and then that promise will inevitably not come through. And this is actually costly because if you're a president, one of the important things you need to do is to be able to credibly commit when you issue threats. The problem that Trump has is that none of his subordinates are trusted by international interlocutors because they know that Trump might change his mind. And if Trump even does issue a threat where he's being serious, the problem is that he's backtracked or prevaricated so many times that even in the times where he wants to be serious, the other actor is not necessarily going to take them seriously. And so as a result, they have an inability to credibly signal what their intent is to others. And an awful lot of international relations is you trying to signal to others what you care about with the idea of getting other actors to recognize that. And then finally, essentially, there has been a wild misappropriation of staff attention, among the White House staff, but also his cabinet officials, where what they are primarily concerned with is salving Donald Trump's ego rather than, doing other things like, let's say, trying to advance the national interest. Now, it's worth asking, does any of this matter? The president is just one person. There's a whole bureaucracy, a whole machinery of the federal government designed to constrain him. And indeed, Donald Trump very often has said that he was going to do certain things only to discover that he didn't have the legal power to do them. And therefore, maybe this is, just sort of a harmless thing. And, it brings up the fact that, if you think about the sort of history of American presidents, it's kind of a rogues gallery. There's a few great men, some good men, and then an awful lot of really horrible people who have been president, and the Republic has survived them. Surely the Republic can survive Donald Trump. And this is consistent with a certain argument in presidential studies, most famously pioneered by Richard Neustadt, that argues that the presidency is a fundamentally weak institution. and that for the president to be able to do anything, they must have the power to persuade. As Neustadt puts it, in form, all presidents are leaders nowadays. In fact, this guarantees no more than that they will be clerks. And so if the president fails to get support from Congress, fails to get buy-in from his cabinet officials or from the permanent bureaucracy, surely that will be an issue. And indeed, there are checks and balances, in theory. We know from the Constitution, Congress was created as the sort of first branch of government. The judiciary, can potentially exercise powers on the president. There is a permanent bureaucracy that has to be managed. And there's a whole welter of norms that have been built up around the presidency that if you violate, can potentially lead to certain forms of opprobrium. But this is where we get to the problem, which is it's not just that Donald Trump is a toddler. It is that essentially we are navigating a presidency that has become super empowered over the last 50 years, both because other institutions have been so paralyzed by partisanship that they've been unable to check the presidency, and also because they've been so paralyzed by partisanship, this has given a wide field for the president to extract new powers. And this is an argument most, famously exemplified by Arthur Schlesinger's The Imperial Presidency, in which he argued, confronted by presidential initiatives in foreign affairs, Congress and the courts, along with the press and citizenry, often lack confidence in their own information and judgment and are likely to be intimidated by executive authority. And indeed, we see this in terms of weakening guardrails. Congress, as I said, has repeatedly and voluntarily ceded powers when it comes to things like the declaration of war and or the setting of tariffs to the executive branch because they recognize that they themselves might not necessarily have the capacity to do so. When it comes to the courts are remarkably deferential to executive authority and loath to wade into disputes between the other two legislative branches. Indeed, they're so reluctant to do this that they have a doctrine called the political questions doctrine that says, in this circumstance, courts should, rule in only in as limited a manner as possible. And when it comes to the bureaucracy, essentially the sort of unitary theory of the executive, and this is something that long predates Trump, you've seen presidents over time figure out how to manage the bureaucracy and indeed to weed out elements of the bureaucracy that are potentially resisting to them. And in terms of norms, this is the area where Trump has, without question, advanced the furthest. Donald Trump has been willing to violate norm after norm, and the very violations for Trump are exercises in power. In other words, the idea that he can violate a norm and get away with it, to him and to his supporters is demonstration of his strength, demonstration of the presidential power. So how has Trump been empowered? Basically, he's been able to do it because in foreign affairs, there remain fewer checks on what the president can do than in domestic affairs. Because he has had a support of a Republican majority in the Senate, he's been able to remake the judiciary, appointing more circuit court judges and district court judges than I think any president has in recent history. He was helped in this in no small part by the fact that Mitch McConnell essentially blocked a lot of court appointments that the second-term Obama administration wanted to do. He has fulfilled Steve Bannon's pledge in terms of deconstructing the administrative state. You see this in disputes in terms of the Department of Justice, the State Department, the intelligence community, and for that matter, the military. Norms have obviously been shredded. And I think in some ways, the most important element of this is that there have been efforts to push back on Trump. There have been court cases. Donald Trump has been impeached. There have been oversight hearings and so on and so forth. But Donald Trump possesses the partisan veto, which is because the GOP is essentially in lockstep support of Donald Trump and has become increasingly so as Trump's presidency has matured. This has allowed, essentially a veto of any sort of congressional override or any sort of court check on the presidency. And as a result, this has meant that Trump has been able to do a lot of things that other presidents might not have been willing to do or fearful of doing in terms of retribution. He has not had that fear. And as for adults in the room, and this was something that was articulated way back in the 2017, this warning from Anonymous should know, back in 2018, he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times claiming, you don't have to worry, there are adults in the room checking Trump. A year later, he acknowledged they were not necessarily the bulwarks that he had thought they were a year before. And so the best analogy I can make, and this is sort of the closing thought to what can be done, is that the way to think about the United States right now is think about it as a car driving down a twisty mountain road. In this scenario, there are two things that prevent the car from going off the mountain. The first is the skill of the driver, and the second is the guardrails that presumably check against that car if it accidentally careens too far to one side. What has happened is that the guardrails over the past several decades have been worn down to a nub. We didn't realize that because we still elected drivers who were perceived as the last adult in the room, the people who would behave properly. And then we elected Donald Trump, and that's what we are dealing with right now. So I will close with this last, warning from the Toddler-in-Chief, which, as I said, was written in, mostly 2019, warning everyone that, God forbid, a real crisis happens, we are going to be in deep trouble. And I would argue that this prediction has unfortunately come to fruition. If there is one recommendation I can make for what should happen in a post-Trump world, or even a second Trump term, we need to child-proof the presidency. And by this, I mean we need to enact measures that a normal adult president would be able to easily surmount, but a child president like Trump would potentially have difficulties doing. Things like essentially putting higher barriers in for declaring states of emergency, or reforming the Vacancies Act. Small measures like this that I think would actually generate some bipartisan support. The other recommendation is that Americans can grow the hell up. It is difficult to blame the American people for Donald Trump. After all, more than 3 million people voted for Donald Trump's opponent in 2016. We are about to have another election in which we're going to see this as a referendum. Max Weber, when he wrote Politics as a Vocation, suggested that Americans cannot continue to be ruled by amateurs. And Barack Obama, in his first inaugural address, said, "We remain a young nation, but in the words of Scripture, the time has come to set aside childish things." So I would argue that Americans need to set aside childish things, which includes Donald Trump, because if Donald Trump gets reelected, he is no longer the toddler-in-chief. The toddler-in-chief will be us. And with that, I will stop sharing the screen and be happy to take questions.